Okay, so good day everyone. So we're gonna be delving about another topic on ELT approaches and methods, specifically on the historical development of language teaching methods. So before I would start delving to our discussion specifically on the historical development of language teaching methods, is that I would like to introduce myself first to you. Hi, I am Mark Jan Bartolome from ADLS 4-1. Now we have here the grammar translation method, specifically the GT, or what we call the GT. Now it is traced to the traditional approach of teaching. Now in teaching Latin and Greek between 17th to 19th century. Later, the method began to be used to other modern languages, including French and German. Of course, the grammar translation method started in Germany and spread throughout Europe. Now, by the end of the 19th century, many schools have adopted the GT method, or they also included the GT method specifically in their learning. According to Arthur in the year 2010, the goals of grammar translation method is to learn a language in order to read its literature. Now, grammar is taught deductively by presentation and grammar rules, which are practiced through transition exercises. Of course, in this way, the teacher will teach grammar lessons rather than pronunciation. And of course, the grammar translation method is a method that lays emphasis on grammar and translation. Now, it only focuses on grammar and translation, not on other aspects, specifically on pronunciation and any other form of uh, learning a language. Now, to clearly emphasize what a grammar translation is, it is a method that lays emphasis on grammar and translation. And of course, it encourages reading and writing about communication. So, reading and writing before was prioritized rather than in pronunciation. Now, reading and writing were done from classical texts. And of course, reading aloud was also adapted. Now, in teaching Latin and Greek in grammar translation, the focus was on the correct grammar or the grammatical rules or the form of structure. Of course, grammar teaching method is on how grammar rules work and memorization, recitation, presentation of bilingual vocabulary text, and of course the translation of literary text, but little room for pronunciation drills. So the focus was on grammar only, not on pronunciation. Grammar translation method during the earliest years were using L1 to L2 or the language 1 to language 2. Now, let us say for example, a Greek language is being translated into English language. And of course, they are solely focusing on written language rather than the spoken language. That's why it only focuses on written, not on spoken. And its weakness is specifically on pronunciation. Now, according to Anna Sidiou in the year 2002, she observed that GT was highly prescriptive, considered to govern, or it has a very strict rule, right? And of course, the GT method assumes that once the learner masters the rules, he has attained competence in the target language. So GT, the concept of GT assumes that when someone learns the grammar rules, it means they have attained competence to the language itself. Now, teaching exercises and questions are done in the native language of the learner. In GT method, teaching exercises again and questions are done in the native language of the learner. Now, they don't focus on the target language, but they solely use the native language, specifically the L1. Now, it also inculcated or taught in the learner's capability of mental description, biological analysis of language into phrases, classes, sentences, and memorization of the parts of speech, and emphasis on ability to analyze and not an ability to use language in real life situation. No, now it only focuses on the memorization and parts of speech, but not on the way that it teaches how students communicate in real life. Weakness of grammar translation method focuses solely on the grammatical rules, but lack communicative competence because it only teaches the students to know about the grammar rules, but not on communicative competence. Why is that? Because in pronunciation, they do not teach pronunciation rather than the grammar rules. They only teach the grammar rules, but they don't teach on how to pronounce and communicatively, or should I say, communicate it effectively with other people. Now, according to you, in the year 2007, the principal defect of the grammar translation method includes the neglect of communication skills. That's what I've said earlier. Now, it has little or no stress attached to accurate pronunciation and intonation. Well, in grammar translation method, the weakness of it is that they only rely on the translation method or the memorization and other forms of grammar rules, but they don't teach about pronunciation and intonation that is primarily used in daily life communication, of course. And of course, translation in language teaching can be useful in reading and writing skills, but not in listening and speaking skills. Now, in reading and writing, of course, grammar translation is very effective. Whereas in skills like listening and speaking. Objectives of learning a language according to grammar translation method is to be able to read literature with literature written in the target language. And of course, it provides students with good mental exercises, which helps develop their minds. And another one is to make them apply the rules to other examples, and of course, to teach the students to write in both their native and target languages through translation. The principles of GT, or the grammar translation, the characteristic interaction in the teaching process is a student-teacher interaction. Now, it's like a teacher or student dynamic, or the teacher protege dynamic, and teacher roles are very traditional or very strict. The teacher is the authority in the classroom, of course, in traditional ways. The teacher is always the boss or the leader. Literary language is considered superior to spoken languages. Culture is considered as consisting of literature, and the fine arts behavior. Culture is ignored. Under the principles of GT, or the grammar translation method, is the language that is used in class is mostly the student's native language. And of course, the meanings of new words are made clear by translating them into the student's native language. Thus, the evaluation is accomplished on the basis on written tests in which students are expected to translate from their native language to the target language. Now, let us say, for example, a teacher gives her students an activity about translating a language or a song, perhaps, to their native language or vice versa. And of course, the questions about the foreign culture or the foreign language itself must be answered as well. And culture is a view that consisting of literature and fine arts. We all know that in grammar translation method, culture is another form that embodies it. And of course, the error correction is very important, specifically to the teacher or to the students, of course, to correct the answers. And of course, the syllabus that must be created, that should be created, must be structure-based. Under the activities or the characteristics of the grammar translation is that the teacher gives activities like the translation of a literary passage. Now, how does that work? Let us say, for example, when a teacher gives an excerpt from a literary passage, let us say, for example, an excerpt from the book of Pride and Prejudice. Let us use that as an example. Now, the students read the book or the excerpt, then translate it into their native language. Now, under the reading comprehension is that students are or must read the passage in order for them to understand what's inside the context or the meaning of what is written, of course. And of course, finding antonyms and synonyms. We all know that antonyms means the two words that are different from each other. Let us say, for example, night and day, chaos and peace, or chaos or order, and so on and so forth. Now, we have another activity, which is the gap filling and exercises, where, of course, in grammar, gap filling includes the filling the blanks or the gaps within sentences. And of course, another principle is memorization. And additionally, another activities or characteristics of the GT, or the grammar translation method, is using words and sentences and composition according to Larvin. Let's move on into another topic, which is the direct method. It came as a result of reaction to grammar translation. Now, it tries to recreate the exposure which children have acquiring language as they grow up. And it entails reenacting the stimulus response approach to the L1 acquisition. So what does this imply? It implies the behaviorist theory by B.F. Skinner, where one acquire a language as they grow up. Now, everything is said in the second language. Now, teachers adopt the second language and never use the learner's mother tongue, or no need for translation. Now, in direct method, teacher uses or implies rules on schools to not speak on their native language, to just speak rather in the target language, specifically on schools like English policy schools, English only policy schools, or in communities like English speaking only communities. That's how the direct method works. And of course, it lays emphasis on spoken language and avoids vocabulary lists and explanation of grammatical rules. Now, it's quite different from the grammar translation method, because grammar translation method focuses on the grammatical rules, and now direct method focuses on spoken language and of course on pronunciation and etc. Now, it is assumed that the correct rules will be picked by the learners with time. Direct method is assumed that the correct rules will be picked by learners by time. So it's quite different from the grammar translation method. in some cases, most students claim to have benefited from the direct method, like the case of Berlitz Language School, but some do not. It is another study that claims that most students benefit from direct method rather than other methods in the case of in Berlitz Language Schools. In direct method, it focuses on the four core concepts of learning a language, of course, in hearing or listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Of course, at the stage of learning, it emphasizes on the four core of learning a language. Now, teacher use instructional materials such as charts, of course, pictures to make teaching and learning more vivid. So, teachers incorporate pictures. We all know that a lot of students are mostly visual learners, of course. So, in this method, the teacher presents pictures and graphs in order for the students to grasp or learn or remember the method of teaching a language or learning a language vividly more than teaching it by reading or etc. Now, direct method requires teachers that are highly proficient in the target language, of course. Of course, we all know that in a language, English language policy schools is that teachers should be proficient on the language that they are using or they are implying or they are imploring to other students for them to learn the language itself. Now, in this method, learners can only be as good as the teacher. Now, when the teacher requires the students to speak in English only, is that it allows them to learn the language effectively by exposing themselves. And of course, with the proficiency of the teacher, it has a big effect on them, of course. The goal of language learning is communication. To achieve this, students should learn to think in the target language, of course. In order for the students to apply or to learn the target language or the second language itself, is that they need more exposure or they need to think about the target language. Move on to the principles of the direct method. Now, the initiation of the interaction goes both ways from teacher and students, vice versa. If the grammar translation method only goes from teacher to student dynamic, the principles of direct method goes on both ways, from teacher protege or protege teacher or vice versa. Now, although the latter is often teacher directed, at the same time student to student interaction is used as well. Now, you can see the difference between the grammar translation and the direct method. And the teacher and the students are more like patterns in the teaching or learning process. Now, it is like intricately made, or they are somehow interconnected, like student and teacher are passing both ideas interchangeably. And of course, it is desirable that students make a direct association between the target language and the meaning, of course. Of course, it is good to for students to associate words or meanings to a target language in order for them to learn it more effectively. And students should learn to think in target language as soon as possible. Of course, direct method implies that students need to think more about the language in order for them to learn, in order for them to understand and imply the target language that they are learning. Rather than in grammar translation method, it solely focuses on the grammar rules because they believe that when you learn the grammar, it is enough, but it does not. Now, under the principle of direct method is the vocabulary. It is acquired more naturally if students use it in full sentences rather than in memorizing word lists. Now, in order for students to use vocabularies, that they need to know the meaning of the word or the vocabulary that they are using, specifically in using it in context or any form of sentences. Now, pronunciation should be worked on right form from the beginning of language instruction. Of course, in direct method, they also focus on pronunciation and the other macro skills. And lesson should contain some conversation activity, some opportunity for students to use language in real context. Now, in conversation activities, it is somehow like a debate or any other form of recitation in a classroom setting. Students should be encouraged to speak as much as possible. Grammar should be taught conductively. Now, in the grammar translation method, it only focuses on the teacher or on how she teaches the grammar rules. But here, in the principles of direct methods, teachers and students are allowed to speak in order for them to learn the target language. Now, there may be never an explicit grammar rule given. So in direct method, there is no strict rules. There are no strict rules rather than in direct method, I mean, there is no strict rules rather than in grammar translation method. Now, students should be encouraged to speak as much as possible, of course. That's what I wanted to say earlier. And the syllabus is based on situations or topics not on linguistic structures. It solely focuses on the topics, not on the grammar rules, unlike the grammar translation method, as I've said earlier. Now, learning a language involves learning the behavior, culture of the people living in the target country. Now, let us say, for example, when someone migrates into another country, is that learning the behavior or the culture of the people there living there, is that you're like learning their language when you try to migrate, or an individual tries to migrate into another country, is that learning their behavior or culture is like learning their language there. Now, culture consisting of the history of the people who speak target language and the geography of the country, or the countries where the language is spoken, and information about the daily lives of speakers and in the target language that are studied. Of course, vocabulary rather than grammar is emphasized. Vocabulary rather than grammar in direct method is emphasized. Another principles of direct method is that it works on all four macro skills, which is the reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Now, from the start, oral communication was seen as basic, and there is no formal evaluation in the class. Students have to use the language using both oral and written skills. And of course, the teacher tries to get students to self-correct whenever possible. The teacher allows students to do self-correction whenever or wherever it is possible. Now, the activities or the characteristics of direct methods includes reading aloud, conversation practice, of course, the communication practice in order for them to imply or to learn the second language, and map drawing. The students are given the map with geographical features unnamed, and the teacher gives the students directions following the teacher's instructions. If the students have to label the map of the country, of course, the gap filling exercise. When we say the gap filling exercise, is that the teacher will purposely create gaps on sentences, and then students will fill them with the appropriate words. And of course, the dictation, that the teacher dictates while the students follow. And of course, the paragraph writing according to Larson and Freeman. Another method came after the direct method, which is the audiolingual method. It is a method that came as a result from the direct method, or to improve the direct method. Now, the direct method is a result of the grammar translation method. Now, the audiolingual method is a result of attempt to improve the direct method. Now, the 1940s, coming up with more structural materials in teaching, the students moving from simple to complex, which is the audiolingual. Now, when they say the direct method, it is more simple rather than complex. Now, audiolingual is way more complex according to the material given. Now, it was further improved in the year 1950s, where students are expected to repeat after the teacher or views language as a behavior. Now, in the direct theory is that learners learn as a language as they grow, or the exposure. Now, in the direct method, it says that language is learned through repetition. It's like it somehow implies that language is learned through repetition. Now, it is influenced by the belief that since language is a habit, it could be developed by practice, or in other words, it can be learned through practice. Now, it had some influence on the Bloomfield structuralist linguistics and greatly influenced by behaviorism. I would like to make corrections about the direct method in this one. The audiolingual method specifically uses behaviorism, where a person learns through repetitive or repetitive learning, and of course in exposure, of course. And the behaviors approach is driven by primacy of speech over writing. Oral drills are placed above writing and reading. Now, in grammar translation method, they use only writing and of course in reading, but not in speaking and listening. Whereas in direct method, they focus on four macro skills. Whereas in audiolingual method, they only they only focus on speech rather than writing. And then oral drills were used, of course, above reading and writing. They emphasize, or they create importance of speech or speaking rather than in writing, in reading or writing. Now, it is developed and extensively used during World War II, employed in teaching soldiers or foreign languages, or the army method. It is used before, during World War II. They call it the army method in order for them to learn. The goals of the audiolingual method is to enable students to use the target language communicatively. Now, it focuses on how to use the target language, or how to imply it specifically in speaking. Now, to do this, students need to overlearn the target language to learn to use it automatically without stopping to think. In order for students to communicate effectively, is that they need to overlearn the target language. And it can be achieved by students forming new habits in the target language and overcoming the old habits of their native language. Now, it solely requires the students to like be drawn to the target language and like set aside their native language in order for them to learn more quickly. And the teacher is like an orchestral leader, directing and controlling the language behavior of his or her students and provides her the students with good model for imitation. Now, in an English policy only class, is that the teacher presents himself or herself as a leader for the students to imitate. And a contrastive analysis between the student's native language and the target language will reveal where a teacher should expect the most interference. Now, the teacher can make interference for the students to understand how the audiolingual method works. And of course, there is a student-to-student interaction. Of course, in chain drills, we all know how chain drills work, where when a teacher asks one student from row 1, then when the student answers the question, another student will most likely to answer the another question that is being asked by the teacher. And of course, in chain drills or when students take different roles in dialogues, of course, in plays, of course, and the interaction is between teacher to student and is initiated by the teacher. Now, in audiolingual method, teacher is the boss again. It's like the grammar translation method and not like the direct method. Another principle of audiolingual method is that new vocabulary and structures are presented through dialogues. The dialogues are learned through imitation and repetition. Grammar is induced from the examples given, or explicit grammar rules are not provided. Unlike the grammar translation method, where grammar rules are very much needed, the principles of audiolingual method only focuses on vocabulary and structures through dialogues and any other form. Now, the oral or oral skills receive the most attention in audiolingual method, and students are evaluated on the basis of distinction between words in a minimal pair or supplying an appropriate word form in a sentence. We all know how minimal pairs work. It's like a word or a vocabulary has the same sound with any other word. Let's say, for instance, the word beard, bird, or any other example that might be included in the minimal pairs. Now, student errors are to be avoided through teachers' awareness of where the students will have difficulty. Now, the teachers, of course, should be aware, of course, where the students make most of the errors. And the syllabus is structure-based, also like the direct method, and of course, the grammar translation method somehow. Here are the activities or characteristics of audiolingual methods. It includes dialogue memorization. Now, dialogue memorization includes scripts or any other form of excerpts to be memorized by the students. And expansion drill. Expansion drill is when a teacher lets the student read the sentence. Then, let us say, for example, the students are having a difficult time reading or in pronunciation, is that the teacher uses or intentively cuts off the sentences into pieces, then read it off backwards in order for the students to understand what is the meaning behind the text. Now, let us say, for example, Maria went to the supermarket, or she went to the supermarket. Now, the teacher purposely cuts the sentences into pieces or into fragments and reads it backwards in order for the students to understand what it means and how to read it vice versa. Now, in the repetition drill, is that the teacher will read a passage or a sentence or poem, and then the students will repeat after her, of course. That is how the repetition drill works. Of course, in chain drill, the students will most likely to answer a question from teacher in a chain-like manner, wherein student 1 will answer the teacher's question, then apparently student 2 or the student beside her will answer another question that is given by the teacher, and so on and so forth. That's how chain drill works. Now, single slot substitution drill works when a teacher gives a sentence or a simple sentence, then the students change the variables or the nouns or the verbs on the sentence in a single-handedly manner. Now, in multiple slot substitution drill is that a simple sentence will be most likely, or a singular sentence will be most likely to turn into a plural form sentence. Now, let us say, for example, she went to the supermarket. Now, when we say she went to the supermarket in a plural form, they went, it will become they went to the supermarket. It is most likely to become like that. Like, I mean, it is used in single slot substitution drill. Whereas in multiple slot substitution drill is that it requires the subject verb agreement. Let us say, for example, they or she went to buy a book. Into they went to buy more books. Now, take a look at its form where it became singular in where it became plural rather than singular form. Now, in the transformation drill is that it allows the students to transform a sentence into a negative one. Let us say, for example, I want to go home. The sentence I want to go home is a positive form. And then students change it intentively into negative one, which is I don't want to go home, where the term don't is a negative form. That's why the transformation drill uh, enters within the activity. And of course, the use of minimal pairs, the words with sound alike words like beard or bird or any other form of minimal pairs. And of course, the gap filling, so where students are required to fill the gaps with words or fill the sentences or the dialogues. And of course, grammar game, specifically handed by teachers. To conclude, the report is that grammar, translation method, direct method, and audiolingual method may seem different from each other, but it allows the students to understand how to learn a language more quickly, and in order to internalize what are the types of learning methods and any other form of approaches in order for the students to understand uh, its implications and how does it work. That's all. Thank you.
I will discuss about the Community Language Learning or CLL. CLL takes its principle from the counseling learning approach developed by Charles A. Curran. A language counselor is someone who understands the struggles students face when learning another language. The teachers helps students overcome negative feelings and turn them into positive energy for learning. Next, we'll talk about the goal of CLL. Students learn to use the target language communicatively. Students learn how to use the language in real-life communication, not just memorize words or grammar. Number two, students learn about their own learning. Students become aware of how they learn best and understand their learning process. Number three, students takes responsibility for their learning. Students are actively participate and take control of improving their language skills. Next, we'll talk about the principle of community language learning. The teacher is a counselor who understands how threatening a new learning situation can be. Teacher-students interaction change within the lesson and over time. It's not a teacher-centered, but a teacher-student-centered. A relationship building is very important. Next is literal native equivalent are given to clarify meaning. Active vocabulary is important. Next, focus shifts from grammar to sentence formation. Language is for communication. Next is pronunciation is developed by reading aloud. Culture is integrated with language. Skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Evaluation is integrative paragraph writing instead of isolated questions. Students self-evaluate. Errors are corrected in a non-threatening way. The syllabus is designed primarily by students. Here are some activities that can be done in CLL. Transcription. The teachers transcribe students' recorded conversation. Number 2, reflective listening. A student listen to their own recorded voices. Number 4, human-computer teacher repeats word as many times as the students wants. No direct correction of mispronunciation. Last is small group task. Students create new sentence using transcript words. Group shares with the class. Next, we'll talk about total physical response. TPR was developed by James Asher. It is based on the idea that second language learning follows the same pattern as the children's first language acquisition. Students listen first, then speaking comes later. Students respond physically to commands. In Krashen's natural approach, 1983 also supports this idea that students listen to the teachers using the target language from the beginning. The goals for TPR: first, students enjoy learning. Learning becomes fun because students use actions and movement while learning the language. Next is reduce stress in learning a foreign language. Students feel less pressure because they first listen and act before speaking. Third, encourage persistence in study. Students stay motivated and continue learning because the method is engaging and easy to follow. Here are the principles of TPR. First, teacher is the director of behavior. And students imitate nonverbal model. Third, after 10 or 20 hours, students are ready to speak. Fourth, interaction is teachers with the whole group and individuals. Fifth, native language is used at the beginning. Sixth, grammar and vocabulary are emphasized. Pronunciation develops through listening. 7, culture is lifestyle of native speakers. Understanding comes before speaking. Spoken languages is emphasized over written language. Students do not read commands until after 10 hours. And evaluating through performing actions, teachers tolerate errors and correct gently. Last is syllabus is multi-strand. Here are some activities in TPR. First, using commands. For an example, stand up, open your book, walk to the door. Next is role reversal. Students give commands to the teachers and classmates. Third, action sequence. Teacher give connected commands like stand up, walk to the table, pick up the book, or sit down.